Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 59 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Florida Panthers, in which the Sharks have lost 3-2 in overtime. So this makes 2 games played against the Florida Panthers this season the only 2 games that the Sharks will play against Florida this year. And in both of those games, the Sharks and the Panthers have gone to overtime, and yet in both of them, the Sharks have come up on the losing side, which is somewhat disappointing. And if you are a glass half empty kind of guy, that's probably just how you view it. However, if you are a glass half full kind of guy, you might be viewing it as the fact that the Sharks claimed 2 of a possible 4 points against one of the league's top teams, potentially even the league's top team, this Florida Panthers squad. Now, going into this game, there obviously was a lot of hype surrounding it, not because the Sharks and the Florida Panthers are such a marquee matchup, but because this was the first time that the Sharks, or that Joe Thornton on the Florida Panthers, would be returning to play on San Jose ice, not in a teal jersey. Obviously, the Sharks did play the Panthers earlier this season, so this is not the first time that the Sharks have played against Thornton in a not Sharks jersey, but that was an away game. This time the Sharks were in San Jose, so the hype was obviously real. Thornton was inserted into the lineup, even though he had been injured previously, so that was nice to see, a nice little return here. But it's actually quite interesting because a few games ago, I was talking about a matchup between the Sharks and the Vegas Golden Knights, and I was talking about how the Sharks Vegas Golden Knights matchup that night wasn't particularly physical, and it didn't feel as though there was much of a rivalry there, and I compared it to a game between the Sharks and the Panthers. But here tonight, in a game indeed between the Sharks and the Panthers, there actually was significantly more sort of physicality than there was in that Vegas game. There were a couple of scuffles, I guess you could call them. Gadjevich and Hornqvist kind of exchanged words, you could say, as Gadjevich ended up getting a 2-minute minor penalty for roughing. And then there was a scuffle between Huberdeau and Barabanov, 2 very unlikely subjects there. And so there was a bit of bad blood between these teams that did make this a relatively exciting game to watch. On top of that, since it was kept close due to score and due to the overtime, these are exactly the types of games you want to see the Sharks play. You do not want to watch them get blown out 8-0. You want to watch them play a close game where, even if they are heavily outplayed, which was indeed the case here tonight against this Panthers squad, unsurprisingly, they did bring it to overtime. There was a chance to win, and even though they came out on the losing end, it was still nice to see. On to the goals here, and this one actually started off pretty well for the Sharks, not just because they would score the first goal of this game, that would come from Logan Couture on the power play, but also because of the fact that for the first few minutes of this one, it was actually relatively evenly played. The Panthers didn't seem to have their feet beneath them, and so the Sharks were actually able to keep up with them. However, like I said, that kind of only lasted for the first few minutes of this game, and eventually the Panthers just began to take over. They would get the game-tying goal shorthanded from Huberdeau to make it 1-1, but the Sharks would be able to hold a 2-1 lead thanks to a pretty weak Nick Milosh goal, and they would hold that lead going into the first intermission. In the second period, both teams would actually end up scoreless, surprisingly enough, considering the Panthers are such a high-octane offensive force. The fact that the Sharks limited them to 0 goals in that second period is rather impressive in and of itself. However, heading into the third period, the Panthers would not be stopped. The San Jose Sharks were just completely on their heels the entirety, or pretty much the entirety of this period. Besides the early Sharks power play that had to expired, and that was actually a big problem for the Panthers this game. They took 6 penalties, if I'm not mistaken. The Sharks went 1 for 6 on the power play, which kind of came back to bite them by the end of the game. In the third period, like I said, Panthers would not be held off the score sheet. They would get the game-tying goal from Vetrano, and they would just absolutely push to try and end this game in regulation. The Sharks would actually manage to hang on by some sort of minor miracle, and so they would claim a point, but in the overtime, it would be Vetrano with his second of the game to get the extra point for the Panthers. So it's a 3-2 victory for Florida over the San Jose Sharks, but still not, like I said, an awful game for the Sharks. They kind of stuck to the system that they were doing earlier on. Unlike the game against the Nashville Predators where they lose 8-0, where they just have absolutely zero chance, completely run over, completely destroyed. Here tonight, yes, there wasn't a lot of even strength success for the San Jose Sharks, but if you actually take a look at the chances, the Sharks only with 2. Obviously, that's a problem, but the Florida Panthers only had 8 high danger chances, which is decently high, but not super high, especially for the type of possession that the Florida Panthers had this game. So the Sharks did a decent job of suppressing those opportunities. On to the players to talk about. This is kind of an interesting situation because I don't think any of these players were necessarily super awful. They are coming into a position where they're just completely outmatched in this game against the Panthers, so it's hard to expect them to do insanely well. Most of them were just hemmed into their, pretty much all of them honestly, were pretty much just hemmed into their own zone for the majority of the time in this game, but like I said, they did a decent job at suppressing chances, so there isn't necessarily any player who I want to call out as having been exceedingly horrible in this game. However, if there are a few players to talk about, first would actually be Timo Meier, who I did think was a bit off in this game, not as though his game was completely terrible, but I mean literally a bit off. He went for multiple passes throughout the night where that were just slightly off the mark. A couple of times on the power play, he tried to work the puck back to Brent Burns at the point, but there was just maybe a lack of communication there or something where Meier just ended up passing it to nobody at the point, and that was actually a big reason why the Florida Panthers actually managed to tie this game early on that shorthanded goal from Jonathan Huberdeau. So Meier, a bit of an off game in terms of actually landing those passes, which is kind of unlike him, I would say. Not usually the type of Timo Meier game that we see. When it comes to the second line, obviously a very important piece to talk about would be John Leonard. John Leonard was a player who played a good chunk of games with the San Jose Sharks last season. Obviously the Sharks, it was a 56-game season, and Leonard played over 40 games with the Sharks. However, besides him starting on the second line for that season and maybe getting an opportunity in the top 6 a couple of times through that other stretch, he spent most of his time in the bottom 6 and not really doing a ton of things for the Sharks offensively. And so he started the year, surprisingly, you could say, in the AHL, and it didn't start particularly well for him with the Barracuda there either. However, as of late, over these past couple of games, a dozen games that he has played, he has been just about a point per game player for the Barracuda, so he managed to play himself into and earning himself a spot in the Sharks lineup, and not just in the Sharks lineup, but in the Sharks top 6, which is honestly kind of surprising for a head coach like Bob Booner. So Dzingel gets bumped down, and eventually a couple days later we see John Leonard come up here. And how did he do? Well, honestly, he was kind of thrown to the wolves a bit. I don't have a problem, and I kind of like the fact that he was put onto a second line looking to succeed. The problem was that he, of course, has suddenly gone from playing against AHL squads, literal AHL squads, into playing against the league's potential best team in the Florida Panthers. It's kind of no wonder that he ends up just not really looking too apparent here tonight. So I hope that this game doesn't affect him too negatively, like himself, as well as his standing with Bob Booner. I do hope that going into the next game for the San Jose Sharks against an easier opponent, that Leonard will be given at least one more chance on the second line, and we'll see how he actually does there when, there isn't as much pressure on him from the opposing team. When it comes to Barabanov and Hertl, they also did not have much success at all offensively in this game, so it's hard to really blame John Leonard for anything that went wrong here tonight. When it comes to the third line, Balcers was of course pushed down to this line since John Leonard took his spot, and he would be joined by Bonino and Nieto as Cogliano would drop down to the fourth line. And similarly, this was not a terrible line for the Sharks. Surprisingly enough, I thought that this line could end up being a disaster, but maybe Balcers was a nice little complementary piece to both Bonino and Nieto. The reason I thought it could be a disaster is because they're already terrible defensively on most nights, not against the best and most prolific offensive team in the entire league. And so coming up against Florida, I thought it could be terrible, but it actually didn't end up being all that awful. So I guess that was nice to see, if you want to put it that way. I know that's not very complimentary of them, but still. And then when it comes to the fourth line, Reedy, Gadjevich, Cogliano, honestly, not much to say there. Didn't really have any impact on the game, I would say. When it comes to the defensive side of things, a couple of players that I do want to talk about, and the first would actually be Brent Burns. Usually, when it comes to these types of games that the Sharks have played in which they've been hemmed in their own zone consistently, where they're just getting outshot and outplayed generally, a massive, massive culprit for this is Brent Burns. Usually, Brent Burns is sort of the person who is a big reason why the Sharks are consistently hemmed in their own zone, because he's failing to get pucks out, he's making terrible reads, terrible passes, and generally things like that. But here tonight, he goes against the grain, and Brent Burns potentially was the Sharks' best defenseman, at the very least on the defensive side. I was actually rather impressed with his play in the defensive zone here tonight. He just seemed to be having better reads. I don't know if he was maybe more energized because of Jumbo Joe Thornton returning to the Shark Tank here tonight. And I know Burns and Thornton were obviously very, very close friends when they were, or at least it seemed that way from the outside. They seemed to be close friends when Thornton was on the team a couple of years ago and for so long with Brent Burns. So maybe he had a little pep in his step, but Brent Burns actually looked quite solid. You could also maybe attribute some of it to his new defensive partner here tonight. Megna ends up on the pairing with Burns instead of Middleton, who is returned with Erik Karlsson, but it ends up being a solid night for 88. When it comes to the aforementioned Erik Karlsson, on the defensive side of things, there was obviously a lot to be desired. Like I said, everyone was hemmed into their own zone, and Karlsson certainly does not excel in that particular area of the ice. However, there were a few great offensive chances for Erik Karlsson. He was involved on a few of the rush plays that the Sharks had, and that's kind of an emphasis on the word few. The Sharks had very few offensive rush chances, and honestly more than half of them probably did feature Erik Karlsson, so that was nice to see. I thought he was rather engaged offensively, but like I said, on the defensive side where most of the game was played, nothing necessarily blew me away. And when it comes to the Sharks' third defensive pairing, I've talked about previously that they're the defensive pairing that are getting mostly the easy matchups, and that usually works out in Miloš and Vlasic's favor. However, here tonight the Panthers are such a deep offensive squad that even when they're up against that team's third and fourth lines, they're kind of outmatched, and so it was not necessarily a great night for those two players. And finally, when it comes to the goaltending, James Reimer obviously did his best to try and get the Sharks a victory here tonight, and you could definitely say stole a point here as the Sharks managed to force it into overtime. When it comes to the goals that he did let in, this Huberdeau one is from very in close, though Reimer having no reaction to it was slightly strange. The first Vetrano goal was from decently far out, but it was kind of a knuckle shot, so also a very sneaky, difficult save. However, when it comes to the last shot from Vetrano, this one was a very settled puck, so he has the ability to read it at a higher level. You could argue that he was screened by his own defenseman on this particular play in the overtime, though it wasn't necessarily the strongest goal that James Reimer had let in. However, when it comes to blame for this game, Reimer is right there at the bottom of the list. He does not deserve any of it. Like I said, he stole a point for the Sharks here tonight. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday, where they will take on, once again, the Los Angeles Kings. A bit of an oddity in the schedule, as the Sharks, once they play that game, 3 of their last 4 games will have been against that division rival, the Los Angeles Kings, and the Sharks have had a ton of success against the Kings this season, and we'll see if that can continue, and they can continue this series sweep of Los Angeles. Class dismissed.